Good afternoon. Today we welcome Dr. Will Hitchcock to the National George C. Marshall Museum and Library. Dr. Hitchcock is the William W. Corcoran Professor of History at the University of Virginia. His work and teaching focus on the international, diplomatic, and military history of the 20th century, particularly the era of the World Wars and the Cold War. Dr. Hitchcock is a graduate of Kenyon College. In 1994, he received his PhD from Yale University, working under the supervision of renowned scholar Paul Kennedy, with whom he co-edited the acclaimed volume From War to Peace, Altered Strategic Landscapes in the 20th Century. Before moving to Virginia in 2010, he taught for lengthy periods at Yale, Wellesley College, and Temple University, where he also served as a dean. After publishing The Struggle for Europe, The Turbulent History of a Divided Continent, 1945 to the present, he went on to write about the experience of liberation at the close of World War II. His book, The Bitter Road to Freedom, A New History of the Liberation of Europe, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, a winner of the George Lewis Beer Prize, and a Financial Times bestseller. His most recent work, published this past year, is The Age of Eisenhower, America and the World in the 1950s, which was a New York bestseller. Dr. Hitchcock, thank you for being with us today.
Thanks very much for having me.
Great to have you here. In the popular imagination, the Age of Eisenhower evokes the image of a better time in American history, a time when the nation's political and economic challenges seemed manageable and solutions imminently achievable. What were the greatest challenges that Eisenhower had on his plate when he assumed the presidency, and how did he go about dealing with them?
Yeah, well, if you think that the generation that lived through the 1950s had, what did they have to look back on? It was the Depression years and the years of World War II. Catastrophic global crises of unimaginable proportion and complexity. So by comparison, the 50s might look peaceful, prosperous, a kind of easy time to govern, and maybe Eisenhower got lucky by being elected president on the eve of this period of extraordinary economic growth. But he didn't know coming in that the 50s would be a time of significant growth and peace. He was determined to make it so, but he didn't. That wasn't automatic. He had to govern through the 50s and through the problems that he faced. He came into office, and one of the major problems he faced immediately was that the Korean War was in its third year, an unpopular war with many Americans overseas coming back wounded or not coming back at all. He faced an aging and increasingly erratic Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union. Stalin would die in March of 1953, right at the beginning of Eisenhower's time in office, but in 52 and coming into the office in January 53, Eisenhower doesn't know that, and Stalin is more and more erratic, more aggressive. So he faces a series of international problems. The French are fighting a difficult, long, bloody war in Indochina. They're looking out at a world that's changing rapidly through decolonization. That's going to present all kinds of problems. So on the world scene, I think Eisenhower faced some significant issues. Eisenhower also, he didn't anticipate this, but he also came into office on the cusp of significant social change at home. And one of the themes that I spent quite a bit of time on in the book is the civil rights movement, which really, of course, predates the 1950s, had started to get going significantly during the Second World War. But Ike was going to face that big challenge in the decade of the 50s as well, as the civil rights movement became a nationwide movement, as it gained international attention. Those were things that he could not have foreseen would become so significant in his presidency. So a lot of the things that I write about are the kinds of crises that presidents like Eisenhower have to deal with, even though they're not the ones that they would have perhaps been best suited to handle. And that's typical for every president. You can't see over the hill.
Sure. Well, about the presidency, Harry Truman said on his way out of office, "Poor Ike. It won't be a bit like the Army. He'll sit here and he'll say, do this, do that, and nothing will happen." Did Truman underestimate Ike's competency for the presidency, his understanding of what it takes to be an effective political leader?
Truman certainly underestimated Eisenhower's political skills. And in fact, Eisenhower had great political gifts. He was charismatic, he was charming, he was just a natural vote getter. He was magnetic, he was physically charismatic. He was, without a doubt, the most sort of, he had the most star power. He walked into a room and Eisenhower was the guy. But he also had enormous administrative skill that he had gained over decades of service in the military. So Truman's remark, which is a wonderful line, very Truman-esque, kind of puts down Eisenhower saying he's nothing but a desk officer. He can't possibly run the White House, American, all the problems the president has to face. But Eisenhower didn't look at it that way. He looked at it as, look, in the presidency, just as in being supreme commander, you got to solve the problems one at a time. You have to figure out the scale of the problem, break it down to its constituent parts, find good people to solve key pieces of it, and keep moving forward. So he didn't ever feel overwhelmed by the scale of the job, which would be natural for any of us walking into the White House and becoming president. You would just feel overwhelmed. But I think Eisenhower's wartime experience meant that he felt, look, he'd literally been through the wars. So that coming into the White House, he knew how to break down the problems, how to attack them, and not feel overwhelmed by the scale of the job. So I don't think Truman gave him enough credit. Of course, they had a very tense relationship as a result of the 1952 election, so that may have helped. That may have had a lot to do with Truman's quip.
Sure. Well, since we're here at the Marshall Library, I have to ask you a Marshall question. Senator Joe McCarthy, one of the leading architects of the Red Scare in America in the 1950s, infamously slandered General Marshall and accused him of being part of a conspiracy against the United States. But as a major figure of the day, General Eisenhower, a protege of Marshall, remained quiet. Why?
Well, of course, this is a tangled story, and in a nutshell, it's not a story that makes Eisenhower look very good. I think that at the end of the day, when Eisenhower was running in 1952 in the high point of McCarthyism, he felt that it would not be wise politically to attack Joe McCarthy, who was a Republican, who himself was running for re-election in a Senate that was very carefully balanced. And that would have split the party between the liberals, Eisenhower, and the conservative old guard party. McCarthy was actually quite popular in the Republican Party. He was quite popular in the country. We tend to forget that. So going after McCarthy, backing Marshall, Eisenhower reasoned, might have hurt his chances of leading a united party into the elections of 1952. So he came to the McCarthy problem through the lens of politics. Then when he became president in 1953, first part of 54, his view was, I don't want to touch that skunk. I don't want to get into the gutter with him. I want to rise above it. I'm the president. He's just a senator. It would be undignified for me to get down on his level. So that, again, was a political judgment. None of these are moral judgments. And I think that's what some people at the time and many of us since have wondered about. Why didn't he just do the right thing and damn the consequences? I think this reveals Eisenhower was a natural politician. And even though he came out of the military, in fact, he had a real politician's sense for what was the politically expedient thing to do. But we all look back on it, I think, with an air of regret that he wasn't more forward in his support for the man who made him. Without Marshall, there's no Eisenhower. So it's a somewhat distressing chapter in the early Eisenhower years.
Thank you. Eisenhower picked John Foster Dulles as his Secretary of State. Can you speak to the Foster Dulles-Eisenhower relationship? How did Foster Dulles become Secretary of State? And in your opinion, was Ike's choice in this regard an optimal one?
Dulles became Secretary of State because he was, in a sense, the leading figure in Republican foreign policy circles before Eisenhower was elected president. He was an advisor to Republican officials, but he was also a very seasoned international figure. So he was sort of the leading Republican spokesman on foreign policy. It was a natural choice. It was an inevitable choice. It was really written in stone when Eisenhower came in. And Eisenhower felt that it was a good choice. Historians have been pretty critical, though, about John Foster Dulles. as Secretary of State. They viewed him as much too hawkish, much too lawyerly, too narrow in his parsing of the issues. They've also suggested, though I think this is wrong, that Dulles had more influence on Eisenhower than the other way around. I think the evidence is pretty clear that Eisenhower was the boss of that relationship, that he did curtail Dulles's more hawkish instincts. And I think that's a good thing. Eisenhower wanted to be a peacemaker at times when Dulles didn't want him to, and there was a little bit of tension there. But Dulles always served Eisenhower the way that a lawyer serves his most important client.
Well, let me ask a follow-up question to that. Had I chosen a less aggressive Cold Warrior than Dulles, do you think the Cold War would have thawed much more quickly?
That's a very interesting counterfactual. I think it's possible. I'm not saying that I think it's certain, but there were a few key moments in 1953 after the death of Stalin when the Soviet leadership was in confusion and was in disarray, and they sent some signals that they were interested in easing the Cold War. And by and large, the United States did not pick up those signals and run with it. And I think that's partly Eisenhower's own suspicion of the Soviets, but it certainly didn't help that he had one of the most hawkish secretaries of state working for him. There were a few other cases through the Cold War where Eisenhower is trying to reach a relationship with Nikita Khrushchev, and it's Dulles who is behind the scenes trying to slow things down, put sand in the gears. So it's an interesting question about could things possibly have thawed earlier had he had a stronger and more peace-oriented Secretary of State. We'll never know.
Right, thank you. Also interested in Foster Dulles' brother, Allen Dulles. In 1954, Eisenhower asked General James Doolittle to lead a task force to review the CIA. 3 months later, Doolittle met with Eisenhower and told him that the CIA's main problem was Allen Dulles, Foster's brother, citing that he was a bad manager, sloppy, highly emotional, and surrounded by incompetent people. Why didn't Eisenhower fire him then and there?
You really put your finger on an excellent question, but also perhaps one of Eisenhower's weaknesses, which is he really didn't like personal confrontation. He didn't like to fire people. He didn't like to, at least when he was president. Different story when he was in the military. I also think the relationship between Allen and John Foster Dulles was incredibly tight, and it would have been awkward, to say the least, for Eisenhower to fire John Foster Dulles' brother. You know, Eisenhower and Foster Dulles spent almost every single, at least half an hour of every single day together. They had a drink together at the end of most days. They were very, very close. And I think it would have caused a rift in that relationship that he perhaps wanted to avoid, which is not a good reason for not firing Allen Dulles. Allen Dulles was a bad manager, but he was also, and this is probably the real answer, he was also a very creative Cold Warrior. And Allen Dulles, despite being a poor manager, delivered results. Results that perhaps Eisenhower would come to regret, but at the time looked like big wins. Dulles and his team, they organized the overthrow of the government in Iran. Dulles and his team organized the overthrow of the Guatemalan government. Two covert operations that Eisenhower thought of as brilliant successes in the first term. And Dulles was pushing on things like the missile program and on the U-2 and so forth. So he was an aggressive Cold Warrior, and I think Eisenhower actually appreciated that about him.
Ike's guiding dictum was, there are to be no more Koreas. Yet his actions seem to contradict this. He sent arms to the French and into China, issued nuclear threats to the Chinese as the French withdrew, and spoke menacingly of falling dominoes. Was Ike a hawk or a dove? Did his actions sow the seeds for the war that followed in Vietnam?
It's a fascinating pattern. Eisenhower said no more Koreas, and what did he mean by that? He meant no more long-running, costly wars, heavy on manpower, heavy with American soldiers on the ground, in pursuit of an unclear political objective. Was the objective in Korea to destroy North Korea? No, it was to defend South Korea, but then that became a little bit muddy because what were they really, in the last couple of years of the war, once the battle lines had stabilized, what were they really fighting for? And Eisenhower came in and said, look, this is a war that either we should win 100% and we should use atomic weapons and push on up, impose victory even on the North, or we should cut a deal, an armistice, stop the war and get out. And he rapidly accepted the latter because he felt it was wasteful of American resources and lives without a clear outcome in view. Eisenhower's military training here is very important. His view of the use of military forces to get a decisive victory with the greatest amount of power in the shortest amount of time. Korea was exactly the opposite of that. So in Indochina, he says, the French can fight, we will give them arms, but we're not going to send in American soldiers, and that's how he played that one. He threatens the Chinese with atomic strikes because of their threatening of Taiwan. That too is consistent because what he's saying is if you want to go to war with America, you're going to have to deal with the fact that we will use atomic weapons against you because we're going to go for total victory in a short, decisive conflict. So there was to be no more long-running, open wounds of the kind that Korea had become.
Moving back to Europe and the Middle East, can you explain the Suez Crisis in a nutshell? What was at stake for Great Britain and France? What was at stake for the United States?
Well, it's a wonderfully delicious topic, full of twists and turns. But in a nutshell, Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal under President Nasser. And they nationalized the Suez Canal, which had belonged to Britain and France. At least they owned the rights to it. So Egypt was asserting its rights to control its sovereign territory, the passage through the canal. Britain and France felt vulnerable because so much of the world's oil that Europe imported passed through the Suez Canal. But more than that, they felt that this was a provocation from a low-ranking, sort of, as they would have said, a third world dictator that shouldn't be able to push the British and the French around, shouldn't be able to take a unilateral action against great powers. So they conspired with Israel, and the three countries invaded Egypt in late October 1956 in order to seize the canal and to overthrow General Nasser. Eisenhower was outraged by this because he felt this went directly against his policies, which was to try to curry favor with newly independent countries in the Middle East and in Africa. He wanted to build a relationship with some of these independent countries rather than replace them as a colonizing power. So he felt it went against his interests there. He was also very worried that the Soviets would be drawn into the conflict because they were already starting to provide economic aid to Egypt. So Eisenhower used his immense pressure to force the British, the French, and the Israelis to halt the war and indeed to withdraw from that conflict. It was humiliating for the British and the French. And it was a sign of Eisenhower's ruthlessness. Even against friends, he could be very, very tough when the chips were down.
Moving to Russia, Eisenhower seemed to have a sixth sense on how to deal effectively with the Russians. He appears to understand them better than did Foster Dulles. Can you speak to the Khrushchev-Eisenhower relationship, how these individuals saw each other, and whether they had a pretty good measure of each other's capabilities?
Eisenhower's views evolve over the 8 years in office, and you would hope that they would. He learned things. He came into office very suspicious of the Soviets in general, because all he knew was Stalin. But after 53, there's a changing of the guard, and eventually by 56, Khrushchev is the man. And Eisenhower meets the Soviet leadership in Geneva in 1955. Khrushchev is just emerging as the main leader, and he takes their measure, and he realizes, look, they don't want war. They're trying to solve a lot of domestic problems. They're trying to figure out how to manage their strategic interests, but they don't want war with America. That's his conclusion after spending a time with them in Geneva. And then he begins to try to reach out to them in his second term. He wants a big breakthrough. He would love it if that was one of his great legacies, was softening the Cold War during his second term. He invites Khrushchev to come to the U.S. in 1959, a fascinating trip. And they don't have a meeting of the minds. They never empathize with one another. They don't sit down and say, we could really do this, because they're both still fixed in their ideological views. But it does have the effect of personalizing the Russian leadership and making them seem human, which under the Stalin period had been turned into sort of caricature evil figures. And I think Eisenhower felt that was at least going part of the way towards a better relationship.
What was the U-2 incident, and should this be considered the low point of the Eisenhower presidency?
I think it probably should be considered the low point. It was a very avoidable mistake. The U-2 is, of course, the spy plane that the United States used to fly many missions around the world, not just over the Soviet Union, but they did fly the U-2 into Soviet airspace in a couple of dozen instances in order to try to take photographs of Soviet missile installations. And the material that they got was very useful in trying to gauge the Soviet missile program. On the eve of the May 1960 summit that Eisenhower has arranged with Khrushchev in Paris, Allen Dulles, back to your question about Allen Dulles, urges Eisenhower to send some more U-2 flights over the Soviet Union so that they can read the other guy's cards at the summit meeting. We'll know what they've got. We'll know if Khrushchev is bluffing about, when he makes threats about missiles. Eisenhower had been very reluctant to do this in general. He'd used the U-2 only very, very cautiously. And at first, he says, no, we're not going to do that. It would be a terrible disaster if they shot one down. Allen Dulles keeps coming back to this. Don't worry, they can't shoot these things down. We know our scientists say they can't shoot them down. Eisenhower reluctantly approves 3 overflights, and of course, the one on May 1st is shot down, and that's Francis Gary Powers' plane. And it's a terrible disaster, one that Eisenhower never owned up to. He really never realized, he never said publicly what a terrible blunder it had been. What he did say was, look, we have to keep tabs on these Soviets because they keep building these missiles, and I'm sorry that we have to fly these spy planes, but that's the Cold War for you. He didn't admit that this had been an error, and maybe that's understandable, but it had been an error, and it was an enormous missed opportunity because Khrushchev wanted to make that meeting in Paris significant. So we'll never know if some breakthrough in the Cold War might have happened had it not been for the U-2 crisis.
I'm going to ask you a question about the clandestine wars of the Eisenhower administration. In your view, were the clandestine wars waged by the CIA against Iran, Arbenz, Sukarno, Lumumba, and Castro, presumably with Ike's knowledge and approval, justified given the high stakes and risk? And given that the U.S. eventually wins the Cold War, it prevails, does the end justify the means in your mind?
No, it's a dark chapter, I think. I think that Allen Dulles' CIA was very aggressive. Eisenhower gave it free rein, in part because he felt that the individuals you named, Castro and Lumumba and others, were genuine threats, not directly to the United States, but to the neighborhood in which those leaders operated, whether it was the Caribbean or Latin America or Africa or Southeast Asia. Eisenhower felt sort of one bad apple could spoil the whole region. And so they were willing to use covert operations, which were relatively inexpensive, and which they felt could be denied, after all. The point of them being covert was that the Americans didn't take ownership of them. And so in a number of instances, the CIA pushed pretty hard and was very aggressive, and I think the consequences of some of those actions, Guatemala comes to mind, were really very, very bad in the long run, over many decades afterwards. Iran is another important example. The Iranians have never forgiven the United States for meddling in Iranian affairs in 1953. So I think it was a consequence of the Cold War mentality that Eisenhower shared, that he believed in, that it was his job to wage the Twilight War. But in retrospect, I think it probably did more damage to American national interests in the long run than it helped.
Right. Thank you. As Eisenhower leaves the presidency, what did Ike think of John Kennedy's abilities? Did Ike underestimate them just as Kennedy seemed to grossly underestimate Ike's? Can you comment on that?
Yes, I think it was a perhaps not uncommon case where the outgoing president feels the new person doesn't measure up. Whoever the new person is. Certainly Eisenhower felt that Kennedy was a bad choice. And it's not that he loved Richard Nixon so much as he felt Kennedy was simply too young, inexperienced. He'd had limited military experience compared to Eisenhower, but then everybody's would be limited compared to Eisenhower's. He was a junior senator, and just generally speaking, not somebody that Eisenhower respected a great deal. And he was kind of a slick character. I think that's how Eisenhower probably would have characterized him. I think in many ways the outgoing military-industrial complex speech, the farewell address, is in part directed to Kennedy, which is to say, watch out, or the generals of the brass will eat you for breakfast, so be on your lookout. But what's interesting is that it doesn't take very long for the two men to change their attitudes towards one another. Kennedy immediately sees Eisenhower's strength and his stature and his abilities once he gets into the White House, looks back, and they care a lot about what Eisenhower is saying publicly even after he's left the White House. But Eisenhower also improves his view of Kennedy because they meet after the Bay of Pigs invasion in the spring of 1961, and Eisenhower gives good advice, helpful advice, and realizes that Kennedy is going to try to fix this thing. And during the Cuban Missile Crisis, there are phone calls. During the Berlin Crisis, there are phone calls. So Kennedy reaches out to Eisenhower and asks for advice. And of course, he doesn't have to take it, but he wants to use him as a sounding board. So it turned out to be a good relationship. And it's such a tragedy that in so many ways, that Kennedy's presidency was cut short. But they didn't really get to know each other, but I think it was the beginning of a very close, respectful relationship.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hitchcock, and thank you for your wonderful book.
Thank you very much. It's a
terrific book.
Thank you.